my sense was, and I'll go back to the office and look into this, but my sense was there's actually quite a lot of feedback, for example, at the staff level and also above the staff level. For example, if you have one particular business that's important to you, then we're going to look at the risk models and we're going to be evaluating them and see that they're capturing evolving risks and that kind of thing. And a lot of that kind of thing comes out in the stress test and in our feedback.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being with us today. In a prior setting, I posited a question with respect to interest rate policy and how it can be applied to various size companies. And I want to, I guess, reinitiate the inquiry, but first begin by kind of laying the foundation for why I'm posing the question. The Fed has a dual mandate to stabilize prices and provide for maximum employment. But when we pursue interest rate policy that applies across the board to all institutions equally, sometimes we may be carving into one at the expense of the other. For example, community banks and smaller financial institutions don't have the same employment figures necessarily as those areas that are more commonly served by the quote-unquote big banks. In the more rural areas that are serviced by community banks, you will find that the unemployment figures are higher than they are when factored against the national average. On the other hand, when it comes to price stability and using interest rates to try and reduce the amount of capital in the economy, the big banks are the ones that are more pervasive in terms of the consumer credit that they issue on a net basis. And so if we were to, for example, raise rates to try and stabilize prices, that rate increase would apply to both community banks and big banks, thereby reducing the lendability of the community banks the same way that they would impact the bigger banks. But what that would do is it would exacerbate the employment circumstances in the rural areas while also containing the prices on the big bank areas. And so my question that I posited in a prior setting that I'd like to put on the record here today is whether or not the Fed would consider bifurcating interest rate policy to consider a different interest rate policy with respect to community banks or smaller institutions and the areas they serve versus the larger institutions and the more broad stroke that they have on the overall financial system. And just to kind of tie up my question, again, in our previous setting, I mentioned that the contagion risk, the systemic risk that community banks pose are more diluted versus the systemic risk that our big banks present. And so that also just kind of puts into my mind the fact that an interest rate policy that looks at both service areas a little differently might actually help to not only improve employment numbers, but to do so in rural areas that are dragging down the overall average, and to do so in a way that may not necessarily impact pricing pressures because it's not an across-the-board rate policy. So could you please share your thoughts on the idea of perhaps bifurcating interest rate policy between larger institutions and smaller institutions?
It's an interesting question. I think it would be, it would not, of course, be in keeping with the tradition of interest rates, which is our policy rate is it applies to the whole economy, and we don't get into distinguishing between different borrowers and that kind of thing. I wouldn't want to see us going down that road. That's more for you, to distinguish between different entities under the law. But I think, again, I wouldn't want to see us going down the road of raising rates different amounts on different people and different sectors. I think the interest rate is a blunt tool. Remember that we're not elected. We're not supposed to be. We're supposed to be with interest rates just operating at the national level, and I think that's probably a healthy thing.